The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.
Tonight, is the world ignoring Sudan's devastating war? Then, New Democrat MP Charlie Angus joins us to talk about the decade of excess that was the 1980s. That's next on The Agenda. Almost 2 years since the Sudanese war first started, anarchy, famine, violence, and mass displacement have engulfed the African state. And while there is no shortage of global headlines that make for grim reading, the ambivalence from the rest of the world, including Canada, has been felt acutely in that continent's third largest country. For more on the current state of the war and what a path to peace might look like, we are joined by, in Kampala, Uganda, by Mutassim Ali, legal advisor at the Raoul Wallenberg Center for Human Rights. In Montreal, Quebec, Erwin Kotler, founder and international chair of the Raoul Wallenberg Center for Human Rights. He, of course, a former Minister of Justice and Attorney General for Canada. And here in our studio, Nisreen El-Amin, assistant professor of anthropology and African studies at the University of Toronto on their downtown campus. Nisreen, it's good to have you back here at TVO. And Mutassim and Erwin, it's great. Thank you for joining us from Points Beyond. I don't want to assume that our viewers and listeners know everything they need to know about Sudan, so we're going to bring up a map first just to show everybody where this country is located. In northeast Africa, it shares a border with Chad to the west, Egypt to the north, Ethiopia to the east, and of course the new country of South Sudan to the south. It has a population of about 50 million people, and the capital city is Khartoum. And here's a quick fact file on some background we'll need to know for this conversation. Sudan's civil war, which is waged between the Sudanese Armed Forces, the SAF, and the Rapid Support Forces, that's the RSF, it erupted almost 2 years ago, April 2023, and it has plunged the country into chaos ever since. Now, according to the International Rescue Committee, more than 11 million people are now displaced within the country, and more than 3 million people, mostly women and children, have fled Sudan to neighboring countries such as Chad and South Sudan. About 30 million people, that's more than half the population, are in need of humanitarian support. Last year alone, more than 750,000 people faced catastrophic food insecurity, meaning that death by starvation was a daily occurrence. Sudan now represents the largest and fastest displacement crisis in the world. Okay, Nisreen, let me start with you. You are Sudanese. How are your friends and family doing over there? Have you been in touch? What do you know?
Well, first of all, thank you for having me. Yeah, my family and friends are obviously dealing with what you just described, the world's largest humanitarian crisis. Life has been very difficult since the war began. They're dealing with food shortages, the collapse of the healthcare system. The schools are not running, right? So there's 19 million children, for example, that are out of school. And there's also food insecurity. And again, you know, this is food insecurity within the context of a country that could easily feed itself. Because again, the economy has collapsed. A lot of my family members are farmers, right? And they haven't been able to farm because of the security situation in the region that's right below Khartoum, the kind of agricultural heartland of the country. A lot of my relatives have chronic illnesses, and so it's very difficult for them to access medication. They have to travel far, and it's often dangerous for them to get medication. Electricity is often out, you know, there's often no running water. So it's been quite challenging.
How often are you in contact with them?
It depends. Sometimes it's a whole month that we don't hear from them, and other times, you know, we are able to get in touch with them once a week. But it's always quite difficult. And for example, I have my aunts and uncles are in a village that's was until recently under siege by the RSF. And some RSF soldiers were occupying their homes, so it was quite difficult to even talk to them because they were essentially under siege, right?
Do you know, are they desperately in fear of losing their lives right now?
I mean, that's, I think, always something that people have in the back of their mind. Lots of people have lost their relatives or have watched, their relatives be subjected to sexual violence, for example. So absolutely, yeah.
I want to share something here. This was from a couple of weeks ago. The outgoing U.S. Secretary of State, Anthony Blinken, who of course is no longer the Secretary of State, but when he was, he shared this on X. He said, after reviewing the horrifying information of suffering inside Sudan, I have concluded that members of the Rapid Support Forces and allied militias have committed genocide in Sudan. The United States is committed to pursuing accountability for these atrocities. Erwin Kotler, let me bring you in at this point because genocide is, of course, a very heavy word. How much weight, in your judgment, does this carry, given that this declaration by the former Secretary of State really came at the 11th hour of an outgoing administration, and the fact that Donald Trump has been quite clear in saying he intends to pursue an American first policy, which leads me to believe this is not really going to be on his radar screen right now. What does all of that mean to you?
Well, the determination of genocide by former Secretary of State Blinken was, as we said in our Raoul Wallenberg Center release statement on the occasion, that it was welcome, but it had been unusually delayed. As you mentioned at the outset, we're close to 2 years into genocidal atrocities in Sudan. And the worst thing has been that it's been almost absent from the international radar screen, even though this is, as you put it, a humanitarian crisis of epic proportions, the worst humanitarian crisis in the world today. You would not know it if you looked at the daily international radar screen, politically, media-wise, and the like. It's overtaken by the international drumbeat of evil, the Israel-Hamas war in Gaza, the Russian invasion of Ukraine, the intensifying axis of evil between Iran, Russia, and China. I can go on. And at the same time, the general backsliding of democracies who've become preoccupied with domestic issues and elections that have been taking place. So it's not on the radar screen, and it'll be less on the radar screen, if at all, with Trump's ascension to the presidency, given his own America First approach, preoccupation with domestic policy. If you look at his executive orders of 2 days ago, no reference with regard to Africa or Sudan. I'm not even sure he knows about this humanitarian crisis of epic proportions.
Let me bring it home in following up with you. What have you heard from the government of Canada on this?
Well, I met with the government of Canada. I had a meeting in my home, actually, with Melanie Joly. This was about 3 months ago, and I told her to put Sudan as a priority on the agenda. There was a statement issued afterwards, but as I said, when I met as well with government leaders, including Prime Minister Trudeau 2 months ago, that we can't have policy by tweet. We need sustained engagement. And now we have a situation where Parliament is prorogued. We had scheduled hearings before the Foreign Affairs Committee to look into the issue of the emergency in Sudan. I had been in touch with the chair of the Foreign Affairs Committee, Ali Assassi. That will no longer take place. After prorogation will probably be in an election. If you look at the statements made by those contending for the Liberal leadership, you don't even see almost foreign policy on the agenda. So I'm quite concerned because the prorogation, the forthcoming election, means that the erasure of Sudan on the Canadian agenda will continue.
Nasreen, what, if anything, have you heard out of the Government of Canada, and are you satisfied with what you've heard?
Well, I mean, I think there's been a virtual media blackout, and I think that impacts policy ultimately, right? For me, I think I've been particularly disappointed in Canada's response on the immigration front. As we know, after the war in Ukraine started, about 300,000 Ukrainians were admitted to Canada. By contrast, less than 3,000 Sudanese have been admitted. And, you know...
Why do you think that is?
I mean, I think it's a combination of anti-Black racism, but also because of who's involved and who's benefiting from this war, right? There are various external actors, including the UAE, for example, that is supporting the RSF, Egypt that is supporting the army, and these are allies of Canada. So I think that's part of it, and also just generally the public isn't as aware of the fact that Sudan constitutes the world's largest displacement crisis.
Mutassim Ali, I want to get you into this conversation now. I guess we should say you're coming to us from Kampala, Uganda, which is obviously a long way away, and the internet is a tricky thing. So we're glad that we've got you back here. Let's just start by having you tell us, what do you know about the state of your family and friends in Sudan right now?
Absolutely. Thanks a lot again for the opportunity. And I think being in Kampala is part of the story. I'm here to visit my family, but also to visit some of the extended communities. And I think my family is lucky enough to make it to Kampala.
Yes. As we said, the internet is a tricky thing. All right, let's just continue our conversation here. Nasreen, I want you to help us follow the puck here, so to speak, because this does get complicated when you consider all the different factions involved. In addition to sanctioning the commander of the RSF, that's the rebel forces, Mohammed Hamdan Daglo Musa, and Sudan's army, chief and de facto leader Abdel Fattah al-Burhan, the Biden administration also sanctioned 7 RSF-owned companies based in the United Arab Emirates. What does the UAE have to do with Sudan in all of this?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. The UAE has made its interests in Sudan very clear, right? Over the last 2 decades, they've invested billions in Sudanese land, real estate, and infrastructure. They're one of Sudan's main trading partners and its largest importer of gold, right, which plays a very large role in this war. They've been essentially smuggling out Sudanese gold in exchange for weapons that has allowed the RSF to sustain its war effort. In my own research, I trace kind of Gulf land investments in Sudan and the community organizing that has emerged in response to that. And as I've mentioned, the UAE in particular have invested billions in Sudanese land. Most of that land is used to produce animal fodder, to boost their own local dairy and meat industry. They then also export these dairy products. They appear on Sudanese markets, and so they've undermined kind of the local dairy industry. And I mention all this because it's part of the context that is necessary for understanding the famine that is currently happening, right? And it's also part of a larger sort of process through which the former regime, the al-Bashir regime that was overthrown in 2019, was really attempting to privatize the agricultural sector in order to attract foreign and domestic investments in agribusiness. And that really decimated the rural sector. These are lands that, of course, small farmers and herders have been using for generations. And it's part of the larger context of food insecurity. And a lot of the herders who have sort of lost their livelihoods in this manner have now become some of the RSF and even the Army's biggest and most willing recruits, right? And so the other thing I should mention about the UAE is that they've also invested right before the war. They signed a multi-billion-dollar port deal along the Red Sea. So they're very interested in, for military and economic reasons, in access to the Red Sea, and that port had an international airport as part of the plan, a private toll road that would connect it to its agribusiness farms. And while it was upended through this war, it definitely, to me, reflects their desire to expand their regional power and to kind of control circuits and networks of production and distribution across the region.
Understood. I will say, obviously, for the record here, we're trying to get Mutassim back on the line from Uganda. Let's continue our conversation with Erwin Kotler here, and I want to circle back to something you said a little while ago, Mr. Kotler, which is the fact of the matter is the war in Ukraine, the war in the Middle East, have captured a great deal of media attention over the last many years, and Sudan has captured almost no attention at all. And I'd like your view on why you think that is.
Well, I think, what Nasreen said about the fact of racist dimension. I mean, I think we've marginalized Africa and humanitarian concerns, generally speaking, in our overall approach with regard to foreign policy. But as I say, the international radar screen, the oxygen has been taken up by the situation in Gaza. I had a couple of students, and I asked them questions the other day. I said, "What's the worst humanitarian crisis in the world?" And almost all of them answered Gaza. And then some brought up afterwards Russia and Ukraine, but nobody mentioned Sudan. And as Nasreen has described it on a very human level, this is the worst humanitarian crisis in the world. When I met with Melanie Joly and then with the prime ministers, that Canada will be assuming, they now have already assumed, the chair of the G7. And I said, put Sudan as a priority on the agenda, and let's use our chair of the G7 to begin to mobilize the G7 with respect to not only accountability, but we desperately need the humanitarian assistance would have been authorized, $1.7 billion, but some only 10% of that has actually been allocated or distributed.
Let me ask both of you the difficult realpolitik question here, which is to say, I take your point, Nasreen, about anti-black racism and why that may be part of the reason why there isn't as much attention being paid to this crisis as there is to others. Is it also unfortunately fair to say, however, that Canada has more direct foreign policy interests in both the Russia-Ukraine war and the Middle East war than it does in Sudan? And we have to take that into account when we consider why Canada hasn't had much to say about this so far. Is that fair to say?
I mean, sure. I think that's that is fair to say. But I also think that there are ways that the Canadian government could, for example, leverage its relationship to the UAE by stopping its arms sales in this context, right? And as I mentioned again on the immigration front, why is there a 1 to 100 relationship in terms of Ukrainians versus Sudanese? There are people who applied for their relatives to come to Canada, Sudanese Canadians, who have been waiting for over a year to get a response from the Canadian government, and there are people whose relatives have died in this process of waiting, and so that needs to be rectified. These are Canadian citizens as well.
I hear you, but I mean, I think one of the realities is the former Deputy Prime Minister and Finance Minister of the country has a Ukrainian background, which may explain why Canada has been much more invested in the Ukraine story than it has been in the Sudan story, right? Christian Freeland. Is that part of the story here?
Sure, that's possibly, definitely part of the story. But again, I think, here's an opportunity to do the right thing and to change that policy, right? And I think, again, part of it is this media blackout, right? And I would actually say that it's not only that there's been a media blackout, there's also been a way of not framing the war correctly. This, to me, is not a civil war. It's an internationalized counter-revolutionary war, right? There was a popular revolution that ousted a 30-year dictatorship in 2019. And really, this war is being fought by military elites who have, for a very long time, sort of controlled the economy and many economic assets. So they're vying for political and economic control of the country, while civilians are kind of caught in the middle. It's a devastating war that countries like the UAE, but also Egypt, are profiting from, right? And so I think it's important to frame it as a counter-revolutionary proxy war, as an internationalized counter-revolutionary war, in order to also draw out some of these external interests. And Canada actually has a role to play as well, because there was a Montreal-based company called Dickens and Madsen, a PR company, that was representing the RSF during the time in which it was starting its counter-revolutionary sort of repressive tactics, right? It caused a massacre during a sit-in during the revolution. And so that too needs to be highlighted, right?
Well, let me pick up on that with Erwin Kotler, because I think when people who are watching or listening to this who do not have a Sudanese background and who really don't know any of the players, as they themselves consider, who do we want to win this thing? Because people, when they look at international conflict, they think, well, I'm on their side or I'm on their side. Who should we be cheering for here, if that's not too absurd a question?
Well, the problem is, and Nasreen said, these are counter-revolutionary elites. The tragedy is that Sudan was on the road to democratization. And in fact, the women's movement in Sudan was playing a leading role in that regard before the overtaking by the two generals. So really, this is a horrific tragedy because it's the only place that I know that now is visiting the second genocide in the 21st century. And yet this one is being totally ignored and almost erased from the international agenda. Now, with regard to Canada, yes, our interest may appear to be more with regard to the Middle East and Ukraine, though I think that's misplaced for all the reasons that have been said. But at the same time, we have international responsibilities. We now are the chair of the G7. And when there was an issue that arose with regard to ICC arrest warrants regarding Israeli leadership, arrest by the International Criminal Court, the Prime Minister said, well, we are a founder of the International Criminal Court and we have to abide by it, etc. Well, if we care about the International Criminal Court, what about, initiating investigations and prosecutions with respect to the Sudanese leadership before the ICC? What about initiating emergency meetings, whether it be with regard to the UN Security Council, UN Human Rights Council, and the like? In other words, we have international involvements, international responsibilities, treaty ones and the like, and now a political leadership responsibility because we're chairing the G7 and we're going to be hosting it in Alberta in June. And if Canada is going to be in abeyance because of both the proroguing of Parliament and then a domestic election, I'm afraid that the whole foreign policy agenda is going to be marginalized, let alone this epic humanitarian tragedy unfolding in Sudan as we speak.
So, all right, Nasreen, with just a few minutes to go here, offer some advice to the government of Canada right now. Erwin Kotler has laid out what the year looks like in the next few months in terms of our ability to command some attention on the world stage. Point one. Point two, what should Canada do?
Well, I think as far as the peace processes that have occurred, right, I think there needs to be a more concerted effort to place some of the, for example, sanctions, and I'm referring not only to Canada here, but also the United States, within a context of a peace process that is based in the region, right, where civilian actors are included, and not only civilian elites, but those who are experiencing the catastrophe of this war, right? And I should say that, if we understand this war as a counter-revolutionary war, then we need to realize that this war is being waged in order to prevent popular democracy, civilian rule in Sudan, right? And to protect the interests of Sudanese elites and their international partners. And in order to break that, we have to place civilian actors in the center, take them seriously as political actors.
Is one side the good side and one side the bad side? I mean, in Russia and Ukraine, most Canadians think Russians are bad and the Ukrainians are the victims here, and we're cheering for Ukraine. Who are you cheering for here?
We're cheering for the civilians, right? And I'll say from my perspective as someone who's been supporting mutual aid networks on the ground, these are emergency response rooms, right? Civilian volunteers who are leading at the forefront of relief efforts, right? They're driving ambulances, they're setting up ad hoc emergency clinics, shelters, right? Communal kitchens. They're essentially running a country in the absence of a civilian state and in response to a quite dismal international aid response, right? While humanitarian aid is being obstructed. These are the people that we have to put our faith in, right? And they have emerged out of a network called the Resistance Committees. There's about 8,000 of them across the country who are sort of the backbone of the revolution. And these are the people that, to me, should be taken seriously as political actors. They should be centered in any kind of peace process that is to follow. Military elites in Sudan have become experts at negotiating peace without ever implementing it. And the high-level negotiation processes we have seen so far have continued to legitimize them without ever holding them accountable. And that cycle needs to stop.
Let me give the last minute here to Erwin Kotler. I don't know if Melanie Joly is still taking your calls, but if she did, what would you tell her she needs to do? Stat.
One, desperate humanitarian assistance that we can take a leadership role, as I said, through the G7. Two, we are one of the architects of the responsibility to protect doctrine in all its configurations, and we should be involved in the responsibility to protect in Sudan. 3, accountability, as Nasreen mentioned, with respect to the proper sanctioning, not only regarding Sudan, but in other places like the UAE, where we have an influence. And finally, with regard to supporting and engaging with the democracy movements and the grassroots movement in Sudan, as Nasreen mentioned.
Terrific. Okay, I want to thank Erwin Kotler for being there for us on the line from Montreal. I want to thank Nasreen El-Amin from the University of Toronto for being here in our studio. And we are grateful that Mutassim Ali tried so hard to be with us, but unfortunately the line to Kampala, Uganda just basically broke down in the middle of our discussion. But we thank him for his contribution and are wishing all of you well as this story moves on. Thank you so much, you two.
Thank you.
Thank you for having us.
Those of a certain vintage might remember Michael Douglas's iconic line from the Oliver Stone film Wall Street. Douglas played Gordon Gekko, said greed is good, and essentially represented the spirit of the 1980s. But it was also a time of resistance, creativity, and hope, according to our next guest. Timmins James Bay MP Charlie Angus documents it all in his new book. It's called Dangerous Memory, Coming of Age in the Decade of Greed. And we're pleased that it brings Charlie back to our studio today. Good to see you again.
Well, thanks so much for having me and talking about the book.
Let's start with a quote from the book, shall we? Sheldon Osmond, our director, bring up this quote if you would. Whether it's the economy and rising labor unrest or nuclear brinkmanship and a new Cold War, the 2020s feel like an 80s redux. The obsession with the 80s isn't new. There has long been a superficial fixation on the era. All right, let's start there. Why?
It's interesting, you know, I think all of us and people who lived through the 80s, we have this sort of cultural memory of big hair and those earworm songs that we just can't get out of our heads and the parachute pants. But when you start thinking about it, I mean, this was an era that led to so many of the issues we're facing now. The climate crisis that was really came to a head in the 80s, what something could have been done about it. The economic crisis that was launched, I call it Operation Break the Working Class, that literally destroyed the whole path of progress from the Second World War on, that led to so much, you know, people losing their pensions, people living precarious jobs. The housing crisis that we're seeing now, these were all decisions that were launched in the 80s. And of course, the power of big data that, you know, has led to the dystopian disinformation age when we were supposed to be all freed by that. So all these things are happening in the 80s. And yet in our cultural memory, it's this fun and simple time. I argue it was a much darker time. But then having said that, it was also a time where people did incredible acts that changed the world. The ending of apartheid, the Berlin Wall fell without a shot being fired. People have to remember how profound it was that people took to the streets to change the world for the better at that time.
I do remember, though, Ronald Reagan had just been elected president, and one of the first things he did was to fire all the air traffic controllers who conducted an illegal strike. What do you think that did to working people's aspirations at the time?
The Ronald Reagan firing the air traffic controllers was a signal. What had happened initially was the Federal Reserve had decided to massively increase interest rates. So again, 80s redux today. But I mean, they ramped them up to 18 and then 21%. And it wasn't just about beating inflation. It was a stated objective to beat the American working class and the American middle class into believing they weren't going to have continually rising values in wages. And then when Reagan fired those air traffic controllers, it sent a signal across the United States and Canada to start going after the union wages, the benefits, the pensions, the health care, all the things that had built the modern middle class came under attack. And that attack is never really ended.
They gave him the noose, though, Charlie. I mean, it was an illegal strike, and he warned them, if you conduct this illegal strike, we're going to fire you. And they did, and he did.
Well, the thing was, is he gave them 48 hours notice. I mean, nobody had ever done anything like that. I mean, we have to go back to the days of robber baron capitalism where something like that was done. And it was about a signal. And after that, we saw a massive full-on assault on union wages. And it happened in Canada, but there was more signs of, there was interesting, and I write about the resistance in Canada. So what you have in the United States at the beginning of 1980s, you have about 25% of the workforce unionized with good pension plans, you know, with vacations. A single parent could send their kids to university. Well, where does that exist now? Now today, you know, the unionized rates in the United States are about 6%. That's lower than it was during the age of the robber barons. In Canada, there was more resistance, and I write about people like Bob White and how
The former head of the Canadian Auto Workers.
the auto
Union.
workers, yeah, and the auto workers in Canada were very militant at that time, and we pushed back, but we did lose a lot of jobs. I mean, we had the largest job losses since the Depression at the beginning of the 1980s, and yet this was a manufactured crisis. This wasn't something like the Depression. This was literally cooked up by the Federal Reserve, by people like Reagan. It was about breaking the working class.
On balance, I mean, I certainly remember the 80s. AIDS, Chernobyl, which was a horrific disaster, nuclear disaster in the former Soviet Union. The threats to nuclear war, certainly the Cold War was at a peak then. But you do say in the book, creativity, hope, community organizing, resistance, that kind of thing. And yet you call it the decade of greed. Why the decade of greed?
It's fascinating because that's what the decade has been called. It's been called, you know, it was, I think, first maybe Time magazine coined it, and that the famous Gordon Gekko, greed is good, from the Wall Street movie. This is the era when, you know, they said Mulroney was the era of Jaguars and condos, and Reagan unleashing, you know, stripping all the protections that were in place for banking and financial sector. So people suddenly started to make enormous amounts of money while other people started to fall through the cracks in a significant way. But in terms of the resistance and in terms of the creativity, you know, I write a lot about Toronto in the early 1980s. I mean, this was this dynamic city where rents were cheap. And, you know, if you went to university, you didn't have to worry about debt so much, because if you dropped out of a course, well, whatever, you get a summer job and you could pay for it. So it was this incredible moment of people, like I write about the music scene, the art scenes, because people could afford to take chances. When I see a young generation, and, you know, my daughters have had to leave Toronto, people who've got good middle-class jobs who can't afford to live here, and almost anywhere, that level of economic pressure, well, where did that begin? So I start tracing through the book a lot of the crisis that we're living today back to these origin moments, and so many of them are in the 1980s.
I do wonder, though, because, you know, I'm trying to imagine if one of your daughters had come up to you and said, Dad, I'm going to quit high school, I'm going to join a punk band, I'm going to try and make it as a musician and basically live hand to mouth for a long time. And I'm wondering what your response to that would have been, because that's what you did.
Yeah, and I write about us quitting school and going on the road and the lessons that we learned. If my daughter said that to me today, I'd beg her not to. But I don't think she would, because a young generation is worried about their future. They're worried about their pensions. They're worried about whether or not they're going to have a job. They're worried about their levels of student debt. They're worried about the planet being in crisis, you know, from the climate fires and what we've been seeing. And it's one of the reasons I wrote the book, because I was talking to some young people once, and they said to me, well, you don't know what it's like to live in a world that has no future. And I suddenly thought, I remember being 18 and watching the dangerous escalation in the nuclear arms race. I mean, we almost lost the planet a couple of times, and I write about it. You know, 1983, everyone remembers the Cuban Missile Crisis. They don't remember the fact that a couple of times over the fall of 1983, the world almost blew up. And it didn't. And it didn't because so many people just took to the streets, ordinary people, mothers, you know, young activists, they didn't know what else to do. And I think that that's a really powerful lesson for today, is that we are facing planetary crisis, and we can't let these things just disintegrate around us because the stakes are so high.
Let me follow up on that angle, though. I take your point, and you make a compelling case that the peace movement of the day and people going into the streets and saying to Ronald Reagan, we don't want you to put those missiles in Germany, you know, facing the Soviet Union as much as you don't like the Soviet Union. What I didn't see in the book, and I wonder whether you're prepared to acknowledge it, was that a Reagan-esque peace through strength strategy was also part of the mix. It wasn't just Gorbachev's being prepared not to get into an endless arms race that he knew he couldn't win. But peace through strength at the end of the day had a role to play in this as well. Would you acknowledge that?
No, absolutely not. I mean, what made Reagan decide to stop the arms race was he saw a TV movie, made-for-TV movie.
Yeah, I know you say that. I watched it too. We all did.
I mean, the movie came out in 1988, the day after.
Yeah.
It came out actually at a moment. So that it's an accidental confrontation in Eastern Europe that leads to a nuclear holocaust. That movie was playing as that scene was actually starting to play out in Eastern Europe.
Yeah, everybody dies in the end of the movie.
It's horrific.
Yeah.
But and it shocked everybody. But that movie was shown to the Joint Chiefs of Staff and the President, which is amazing, a made-for-TV movie. And I think it really shook Reagan up. And as for Gorbachev, what he said made him go to Reykjavik to begin the peace process was he was so inspired by the young women who went to Greenham Common military base. And I remember back in the 80s, they were being laughed at and ridiculed as these crazy women who formed these massive, like 30 and 70,000 people, women, gatherings outside the military bases. And Gorbachev said that it was the determination of those women that made him think there were people on the other side that he could negotiate with. So I think in the end, the peace through strength, that's been the big argument, but it was actually ordinary people. And I do write about in East Germany, like the fascinating role of the punk rock movement that was being beaten and attacked by the Stasi, getting involved with the Lutheran Church protecting the punks in East Germany, and then starting to form this resistance to the communist state. There's a lot of hidden histories, and that's why dangerous memories that aren't told about those times. So I try and go down some of those rabbit holes to sort of say there were a lot of other really interesting things that we just never got taught.
Did you think, though, that when you were playing the punk music back in the day that you were somehow contributing to a movement which, taken to its logical extension, would have a positive impact on the world?
I think one of the things that was really powerful about the 80s was that you felt like things mattered. And so one big thing was apartheid. And I mean, there was no sitting on the sidelines. And the role of artists and musicians at that time, and, you know, Bob Geldof's come in for a lot of criticism, you know, recently over We Are the World, but that was a staggering gathering of people to raise money to respond to the horrific Ethiopian crisis. The apartheid, the boycotts had a huge impact, and so we were a young band. You know, we were nobodies. We were nominated for an award in Toronto. L'Étranger, our punk band, and then we found out that the sponsors had ties in South Africa, and we didn't go to this awards dinner that probably screwed our career in a big way. But that's the way it seemed. It seemed like you had to take sides in the 80s. And I think that in an age where we feel cynical and everybody's on doom scrolling, a lot of artists actually stepped up, and that did make a difference. How much of a difference? I don't know, but it inspired people to feel that they could make a difference.
In your view, what was the most politically influential group of the time?
Well, there was... I think there were so many. I think in the United States, Bruce Springsteen was certainly a voice for, you know, writing about what was happening to the American working class. Politically, the Clash, you know, in England. We played with the Dead Kennedys, but that was a hellhole show, and
you almost got your.
We almost got killed playing for the Dead Kennedys.
You did, yeah.
But again, a lesson from that was like we also saw the rise of fascism, and I'm not saying the Dead Kennedys were fascist, but there was a lot of like what we're seeing now. You know, Proud Boys, a lot of this sort of race anger. Music was used as a form of resistance to bring people together, to bring people across party line or across racial lines. And in Toronto, the Rock Against Racism movement played a huge role in de-escalating racial tension at a time when there was a lot of racial tension. And we forget that Toronto in the 80s did have a lot of racial tension. We forget the horrific violence against the gay community that was almost normalized. And I write about AIDS, and, you know, okay, I was a straight Catholic kid. I didn't know a lot about what was happening then, but those forms of resistance changed things forever. And the first Toronto Pride was an act of resistance against local cops, and now it's like one of the biggest festivals in North America. So there are incredible stories that we can learn from, but there are also lessons we got to learn not to repeat.
You mentioned the biggest groups of the time, the most influential groups. What about a song? What was the most influential song/anthem of the 80s?
Well, I actually did. I did my top 40 Charlie Angus Dangerous. Remember, you can check it out on Spotify. And I picked the #1 song. It was 99 Luftballons by Nina, which was such a great dance song. But I picked that song because the whole idea of these 99 balloons crossing over into Russia, into Russian territory, and they see it on the radar
for
screen.
Nuclear weapons.
And it causes this nuclear explosion. That scene was actually playing out when that song was all over the radio. So I said, talk about prescient. Everybody's dancing in the clubs to 99 Luftballons as that scene was actually almost playing out. You have to read the book to know how it almost played out. But again, it's a fascinating thing about the 80s. So much of the politics, so much of the fears, so much of the uncertainties were in the music. They were in the arts. And it was a reflection of that time.
Now, they still play Imagine on New Year's Eve in Times Square by John Lennon. All these years later, whatever it is. How many years? I guess he wrote that in 1980, something like that. So here we are, almost half a century later, and they're still playing it. Did that make your top 40 list?
No, what I did was just Starting Over was the last song John Lennon did just before he was assassinated. And again, John Lennon's assassination, I think, in a sense, kicked the 80s off. It was suddenly we were cut adrift. But, one of the things, we talked a bit earlier about Chernobyl, like things like Chernobyl, the meltdown that happened there, we are seeing the ghosts of the 1980s being played out in the Ukraine war. I mean, Putin, the very first thing he did when he invaded Ukraine was he drove his tank straight to Chernobyl, what was on the road. But, I mean, Chernobyl brought the Soviet Union down. The anger over what had happened in that nuclear catastrophe, the role Mikhail Gorbachev was trying to do glasnost and openness, but they couldn't cover up the devastating impacts. And that was a key element of Ukraine becoming independent. And now we're seeing, like with Putin and the war and the talk of a rising missile crisis now that's happening between the United States and Europe and Ukraine. We're going back into these dark ghosts of the 80s, and I think we gotta be paying attention to how dangerous that is.
I want to play you 20 seconds of a song that you may remember, had something to say about life in this country back in the day. Sheldon, you want to roll this, please?
To Fort Capel came a dapple gray. His children caught blood in the autumn rains. Broke the treaty when the buffalo failed. Fenced the land for the CP rail. There's four horses at the Great Divide.
Now, for those who are listening on podcast and did not see that clip, that's Charlie Angus singing out in a field somewhere. The song
in the Capel Valley in Saskatchewan.
There you go. 4 Horses is the name of the song. What's that song about?
That song is about how the treaty that was signed out in the Capel Valley that turned over the land to the Canadian state. And the promise was, because the Cree and the Blackfoot knew the buffalo were disappearing and that they would share the land. And what Canada did was, when the buffalo failed, they cut the food off and starved them and took the land to put the railway through.
You know that's, I know that's what the song's about, and I know you've got that graphic up right off the top, alleging that Sir John A. Macdonald purposefully starved the Indigenous people of the day. You know there is great scholarly controversy about that allegation.
Well, certainly, but many of the people who were involved in that starvation campaign did pretty darn well historically, and I certainly tell people they should read Clearing the Plains by James Dashuk. It's a powerful book. But these are histories we need to confront, and I think we are confronting them. And I will say, again, in a positive sense, is that these were things we were never taught in school. I mean, the punk club that we used to play, The Edge, in Toronto, our favorite place was the home of Edgerton Ryerson, who's, you know, had a huge role in the residential schools, and we didn't know those histories.
He also created the first free public school system in the province of Ontario.
Yes. And
I'm just saying, both sides of the argument?
But I think we never got to the other side of the argument. We never heard the Indigenous story. We never heard about the starvation. We never heard about Poundmaker and the mass hanging of braves who had just come to the fort to get food, and they sent the army against them. And there would have been a battle much worse for white soldiers than the Little Bighorn. Poundmaker didn't let the soldiers die. You know, we never learned any of those stories. So sometimes songs, and so I wrote that in Four Horses. This is our history, and we need to confront it.
That is one of the reasons why we wanted to bring that up, because you having done both, I'm curious as to what you think actually moves people more, a great political speech or a great political song.
That's a really good question. Here's my take on it, is that people know if a song's bogus in the first 30 seconds, and that's why songs have to be truthful. And so, you know, if a song is just blah, but songs can change things. I come from the Irish-Scottish tradition. Our history was taught to us in songs. We know all about the perfidy of the English during the famine because of those songs. And I think speeches can do a great deal as well, but I think when we live in the world of slogans and we live in the world of message box, we don't end up with great speeches. So a great song and a great speech, I think, has to come from the heart.
You remember the Dixie Chicks were famously told, you know, shut up and sing. Is there too much politicking in singing these days?
I don't hear enough. If you know where it is, I will find it out. So, but I think songs, again, it was the power in the 80s. I think songs, there was amazing, crazy, dumb dance earworms, and I love them all. But there were also amazing songs, you know, songs about the nuclear holocaust that we were fearing, songs about insecurity, songs about the frightening state of the world. They were all there, and some of them just had great dance beats. But we like those, and they become part of our cultural landscape, and we need that cultural landscape. Which is, so when for me with the book was to try and look at the 80s through a perspective of a place that I knew, which was Toronto. But how did all that come together, and how did we lose some of those important things as well, and how do we restore it? Those are fundamental historical, but political and also cultural questions.
We started with a quote, so let's end with a quote. Here's another one from the book. Sheldon, if you would bring this up, and I'll read out loud for those listening on podcast. There is a hell of a lot of work to do now, writes Charlie Angus. Some of that work will need to be systemic and political. But there is work that can be done in our communities, in building up our own fragile relationships and local ecosystems. Call it climate mutual aid. Call it punk rock time. And so, yes, I am full of both dread and hope. What's the most hopeful lesson you took from the 1980s that could be helpful to us today?
I think is that when you look at something as big as the planet blowing up and not knowing how a single person could make a change, if enough single persons come together, change starts to happen. And that's what I try and write about in the book. That's my hope, is that things seem monolithic and they seem impossible until suddenly they're not. But they only become not impossible if we step up. And so my mutual aid is I think we need to rebuild communities. We need to start reaching out. We got to get off doom scrolling. We live on doom scrolling. We have to rewire our brains to be more open to just going to a public meeting. Does anyone go to public meetings anymore? Well, that's what we used to do, right? Go meet someone, go talk to someone. We have to start rebuilding community because I think we let too much of that slip.
Dangerous Memory, Coming of Age in the Decade of Greed, is Charlie Angus's latest contribution to the library shelves and presumably some bookshelves in people's homes as well. And we thank you for coming into TVO tonight and talking about it.
Thank you so much.
From a very young age, Lola Reed Allen's eyes were drawn to the sky. When I was a little girl, I'd walk home and I was fascinated by the clouds. I guess I've always just wanted to be up there flying with the birds.
Her fascination with aviation started with the aerial acrobatics of the Royal Canadian Air Force's Golden Hawks, seen here in the CBC archival footage. Her first flight came during a family trip from Toronto to the prairies. 7-year-old Lola didn't know it then, but she was destined for a career up above the clouds.
It was like a roller coaster ride at the fair. It was in 1962. We were going from Toronto to Regina for a family reunion. And we'd gone many times before. We'd by car, by train, never by airplane. In 1962, people just did not hop into airplanes.
Growing up in the 60s, the trip would serve as a reminder that a career in aviation for women was just a foolish dream.
They were good people, just not attentive parents. And my father was very definitely misogynist. So when I said, hey, Dad, this is great. When I grow up, I want to be a pilot, it was like, don't be silly. Girls don't fly.
The Belleville, Ontario native is now sharing her journey as a pilot in her memoir, Highway to the Sky, An Aviator's Journey.
So I'm just checking the fuselage here just to make sure that it isn't visibly dented or are there any problems.
Throughout her 3-decade career, Lola worked as a pilot, flight instructor, and commercial aviator. These days, she doesn't get up in the air as much as she did as a working pilot, but we met up with her at the Durham Flight Center in Oshawa, Ontario, to return to her happy place.
All right, so you're both still buckled in. It was empowering. I remember the first time I went solo, the plane literally just whooshed off into the air. It was again a beautiful day. And I do like to fly solo. It's quiet and no one has any expectations of you, except to get the plane back down on the ground.
There were, however, many expectations of women at the time, none of which included them flying thousands of feet in the sky. Women pilots have always been far and few between, even though they've been flying as long as men.
The first licensed female pilot was Ramon de la Roche in France, March 8th of 1910. But because of social constraints, social expectations, women didn't fly. And there were no role models.
It would take several more years after her maiden flight before Lola would learn to fly. With a child and secure career in banking, her then husband surprised her with flight lessons.
When the instructor asked if I wanted to take control, I said, no way, I want to have a lesson first before I take control. I was pretty much in awe of all the instrumentation. There's a lot of, bells and whistles inside. I was a little daunted.
That lesson would be the beginning of a new chapter. Lola would divorce and leave her job at the bank to pursue a full-time career in aviation. She would amass many firsts in her more than 6,000 hours in the air.
I didn't really feel any challenges until I started, as my grandfather so eloquently put, started taking jobs away from men. Then I started really getting the pushback. And part of that, again, from my colleagues, was that they didn't understand why. Their mothers were stay-at-home moms. Their girlfriends or wives were. I was the odd person out, and I was trying to fit in. A couple of them were definitely against me, but most of them were like, they just really didn't understand why I wanted to do it.
According to Lola, fewer than 6% of commercially licensed pilots are women, a number that hasn't grown since the 80s. Tales of gender discrimination in the aviation industry are well documented. In 1934, Helen Ritchie, the first female commercial pilot, had to fight for her place in the sky.
She didn't last very long because the all-male flight crew basically drummed her out of business. They persuaded what is now the Federal Aviation Authority in America that women shouldn't fly at night and they shouldn't fly in poor weather conditions. You're going to have bad weather days, it's going to be nighttime. And so within a few months, she quit. But it wasn't until nearly 40 years later, 1973, that the first 3 commercial pilots were hired in Canada and America. 1 in Canada, 2 in America.
Lola has faced blatant and subtle forms of sexual discrimination during her career. She's been offered preferential treatment in return for sexual favors, lost jobs to less experienced male pilots, and been mistaken for a flight attendant.
On some of the northern bases where we'd have to load baggage, that's normally the job of the first officer, so I'd be out there loading baggage, and men would be aghast that I would be loading the baggage, and some men would literally try and pull the bags from my hand, and I was like, no, like you wouldn't ask a man if he was capable of doing that, so just let me do it. So what I would actually do, because after a while it gets pretty frustrating, I would take the suitcase and I would just whoop it into the baggage, and it would, ricochet around. And again, those are well-meaning people, but in essence, though they're well-meaning, they're still also saying in their mind, oh, she's not really capable of doing this job, or where's the guy?
Just 10 years ago, a female pilot of a WestJet flight was left this note from one of her male passengers. It reads, "The cockpit of airliner is no place for a woman. A woman being a mother is the most honor, not as captain. I wish WestJet could tell me a fair lady is at the helm so I can book another flight."
And I thought, this is the kind of stuff that I put up with. What's going on? And then it was that point I decided that what I didn't really want to go fly commercially anymore, but what I wanted to do was encourage more young women to become pilots.
Lola is a member of the 99s, an international organization that provides networking and mentorship for professionals and recreational female pilots. She's also part of the Northern Lights Aero Foundation here in Canada with the same goal, to inspire the next generation of female aviators.
I proved to myself that I could believe in myself and I could accomplish something that was different, that was worthwhile. I'd like to hope that people will be inspired that despite the odds, you can achieve your goals, to think about what you might really want to do and go for it, even if it's not in aviation. Because I do talk about a lot of other things. It's a snapshot of what life was like for many women and what the expectations were. And I still think that in the back of many people's minds, those expectations are still there.
And that is the agenda for Thursday, January 23rd, 2025. Tomorrow on the program, John Michael McGrath and yours truly will discuss Doug Ford's reaction to the inauguration of Donald Trump. I'm Steve Paikin. Thanks for watching TVO, for joining us online at tvo.org, and we'll see you again tomorrow.